Hello and welcome. Today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about a couple of concepts, specifically Creole, Creolite, and Creolization. Now, when you hear the word Creole, chances are the first thing that might come to your mind is food, particularly the food associated with Louisiana and the French communities there, so in the USA, but also perhaps more broadly food from the Caribbean, maybe from Cape Verde, so islands off the west coast of Africa. In addition, you might well think about people, Creole people, meaning in that Louisiana context, those French communities or French sort of cultural communities whose background is some kind of combination of African, European, perhaps indigenous American elements. Beyond food, beyond tourism, beyond cultural communities, the word Creole is perhaps most commonly understood in terms of linguistics. This is because ideas about what the Creole is and how it develops were instrumental in early 20th century linguistics. There, they form part of a developmental sequence, beginning with something called a pidgin, that's Pidgin, following which you would have a Creole before you would eventually have a full-on language in a process known as nativization. The idea it being that pidgins were sort of small-scale languages that developed through contact codes used only for trade. In other words, when you had, for instance, Chinese merchants, British merchants, who were mutually unintelligible to one another, but they wanted to facilitate exchange, they would then pick up certain words from one another to bring that about. In that model, a Creole appeared when children who grew up speaking the pidgin as their first language expanded its structures in an effort or a need to be understood. In other words, it was understood as a more complex kind of version of this trade tool. Effectively, then, there's a stage narrative, pidgin first, Creole second. These ideas treated European languages as the main source of structure, and in the case of the Caribbean, they saw African or indigenous inputs as largely marginal. In other words, they were often seen as a kind of degraded version of European languages. This kind of sequence, pidgin to Creole, no longer fits with current research. Instead, throughout the 20th century, detailed description of Creole grammars came to show that patterns really can't be explained through the simple expansion of a trade code. Instead, now Creole has come to be understood instead as a kind of a language developing through contact, specifically in multilingual environments. In the context of the Caribbean, we're talking plantation environments where speakers drew on several linguistic resources at once. Partly, we can say that pidgins were already more complex than older theory assumed, but more than this, we can say Creoles are, in linguistic terms, are effectively a coming together of elements from different language, and often it was the grammar of one language and vocabulary from others. In particular, within a Caribbean context, you can think about why this might have happened. Slaves were forbidden from speaking in their own languages because the slave owners didn't want to allow them to foment rebellion or to criticize their masters. Therefore, they had to speak in languages which they were not taught because they were also not educated, were deliberately kept from schooling. So the consequence is they have to speak a language that they don't speak and they're never taught to speak fluently. As a result, what they do is take some of the vocabulary that they have learned or picked up through communication and then adapted it by grafting it onto older linguistic structures from Igbo or Yoruba in the case of West African migrants. This kind of thinking about Creole, not as some kind of degradation, but as a means of bringing together different languages to form something new, form something vibrant, then in the sort of late 20th century, we're talking the 1980s, the 1990s, it started being applied outside of the sphere of linguistics within a new sphere, that of culture, and more specifically at first, that of literature. This was especially the case among a group of Francophone Caribbean writers, Francophone meaning those who speak French or French Creole, especially those from the island of Martinique. These writers banded together and created a movement known as Creolite, which means in English something like Creolization. Or Creolity. It's a rejection, effectively, of purity narratives and a celebration instead of cultural formation that is hybrid, that is mixed, that is bringing together strands from different parts of the cultural backdrop of the region. Now, this kind of writing was self-consciously hybrid or self-consciously drawn from different cultural backgrounds. Now, I've been speaking in terms of hybridity, but strictly speaking, hybridity and creolization represent two similar but slightly distinct concepts, and it's worth unpacking them a little bit to get a sense of what creolization is saying and what it's not saying. Now, hybridity as a movement, as a way of thinking about culture, became popular especially in the 1980s and the 1990s, largely through the work of Homi K. Bhabha, the post-colonial Indian scholar. His version of hybridity suggests that there are two pre-existing cultures, let's say for instance African and European culture, and that when they come into contact with one another, that there exists a kind of third space between them, in which is a side of tension, of negotiation, in which neither of them exist anymore in their pure form, that they become fluid, they break down a little bit. And for Bhabha, this represents a means of resistance against colonial authority, because through this mergence, through this kind of side of negotiation, there is the scope to break down these pre-existing hierarchies. Creolization as a model is slightly different, because what it takes issue with is the idea that there are pre-existing pure cultures along the lines of European and African, like as if these cultures are large monolithic blocks. The Caribbean, if we think about what kind of makeup it has, well, it's different, depends on different islands, but generally there will be various European influences. So these might be British, they might be Spanish, they might be French, as well as in some cases indigenous groups like the Arawak or Carib peoples, as well as different communities from West Africa. And then more recently, owing to waves of migration from the Indian subcontinent or from East Asia, in addition to places like Syria and the Middle East, we end up with what is effectively a cultural melting pot, many, many different cultures coming together. The kind of culture that we then think of now as being Caribbean is fundamentally a mix, a kind of intermixing of all of these different cultural backdrops. What this process, what creolization suggests as a model, is that actually all cultures can perhaps operate in a similar way. That is, when we look at, say, French culture, what is French culture? Is it a single monolithic entity, or is it not also made up of historic strands that come from elsewhere, also intermixing in much the same kind of format? That if we think along these lines, we can potentially suggest that this kind of the processes that we see in the Caribbean that have formed these hybrid, or what we might call hybrid cultures, but we might perhaps more fully call creolized cultures, that it is possible that this kind of dynamics have existed elsewhere. And this is a major strand of thinking within Caribbean and more broadly post-colonial cultural scholarship. Now, there are arguments on both sides about whether the Caribbean should be seen as totally distinct, owing to its unique history, or whether it is demonstrating in an extreme form something that's happening broadly across the world. Now, going off of that first side, we might say this is position taken up by, for instance, Stuart Hall, where he argues, yes, we can see something similar in terms of this process of fluid exchange of relational kind of dynamics between cultures that have no pre-existing purity. Yes, that is true generally, but we shouldn't try to extrapolate from the Caribbean, or if we do, we end up opening up potential problems, or we end up losing some of the unique elements that make up the Caribbean history. In other words, the influence of slavery, the violent destruction of the indigenous peoples for the most part, the ongoing racial dynamics. That to remove that kind of history and apply the model elsewhere is in some effect to sanitize what is going on in the Caribbean. However, other Caribbean theorists, for instance Edouard Glissant, proposed precisely the argument that I was indicating earlier, that actually, yes, the Caribbean is one specific region, and perhaps one where these forces are seen most extremely. However, it doesn't follow that nowhere else operates in a similar way, only that the extremity of the Caribbean is what renders it so clear-cut. Now, if we follow through this line of thinking, this idea that perhaps these dynamics or something approaching them exists everywhere, and has done throughout history, we start to understand some of the research which is being done at the moment and over the last decade or so on this topic. We get, for instance, edited collections like the work Creolizing Europe, which applies this kind of thinking to European cultural history. In doing so, it's challenging views that see Europe as being culturally self-contained, arguing that the different strands that make it up have always come from elsewhere, and that there's no internal consistency. Right, so if we think about, I don't know, elements that might be seen as typically European culturally, that is things like rationality, you might instead chart the ways in which the notion of rationality comes in part through an association with the irrational projected onto other continents or other cultural spaces, as well as the ways in which the ideas that underpin European rationality really come mediated through the Islamic world prior to the Renaissance. What this kind of framework does, in other words, is helps us analyze cultures as being shaped through their relations with one another, an ongoing transformation. We don't see them as being fixed or monolithic. We see them as changing over time in response to one another. Quite literally, we can say the cultures constitute one another, or they co-constitute one another, because they also, they themselves are made through those which they are not. Now, how can we apply this kind of thinking in literature? To think of an example, to provide a useful example, I think it is instructive to take a look at T.S. Eliot, a figure who is widely known, whose work is thoroughly researched, and who, if we know anything about Eliot's thinking about poetry, wanted to protect what he saw as a European poetic tradition. So in his famous essay, 1919, Tradition and the Individual Talent, Eliot makes the argument that as the modern world becomes more and more complicated, more diffuse, more fragmented, that poets need to gain what he calls the historical sense, meaning they have to read from all different parts of European literature and have to read sort of not privilege any one kind of set of writers, but go right the way from the Middle Ages to the present day, in an attempt, having done this sort of reading, to get a sense of what he calls the mind of Europe. Right? Therefore, once they have this, they can allude to works from the past to bring them into a kind of present unity, to create a coherence, to preserve or recreate the European poetic tradition. Now, what's interesting about this, if we approach it from the perspective of creolization theory, is that within Eliot's own thinking come ideas that actually circulate from elsewhere. What I mean by this is, if we know Eliot's essay pretty well, we know that Eliot argues for an impersonal theory of poetry. What does he mean by this? Well, he is suggesting that rather than trying to bring their own background, their own proclivities to their work, that great writers should instead write impersonally, meaning they channel the spirit of their age, that historical sense that they get from reading widely. But this idea about impersonality, where does it come from? Well, in addition to some European precedents for it in European philosophies, it is also associated with Chinese and Japanese Buddhism. Eliot actually studied, as a PhD student in Harvard, Indian texts written in Sanskrit and Pali, and beyond this also some work in Japanese philosophy. And he was turning in circles, all of whom at that time in Boston were very interested in precisely these kind of modes of thinking drawn from East Asian Buddhism. So this kind of thinking about poetic impersonality that you have to achieve to create a European tradition seen as a kind of monolith, this it's in tension, right? Because actually the idea underpinning it is coming from East Asia, it's coming from elsewhere. And if we've read any of T.S. Eliot's work, perhaps we've read The Wasteland, we'll know that he draws in sources from other literary cultures, meaning he brings in the shanti part, right, from Hindu philosophy. So we can say, actually, what Eliot is arguing for is a kind of monolithic tradition, but in doing so, he is effectively producing a creolized theory. If we apply this more broadly and beyond Eliot, we can say that those modernists then later in other parts of the world who read tradition and individual talent, who read the work of Eliot, Joyce, Ezra Pound, and so on, and then produced their own modernist writing, that if they came from, for instance, East Asia, that they may well have been criticized for being derivative of the kind of work Eliot was doing. But actually, these ideas that Eliot was, that were animating Eliot's poetic project, came in fact from, often, East Asian traditions. So really, they were responding to something already drawn from their cultures. And we think about, well, where did those ideas come from? We go back and back and back. We're applying this kind of Creolization thinking. We can say what we see in modernism, just as an example, is the outcome of circulating, overlapping, unequal contact among different intellectual traditions. We don't have a kind of pure European modernism of the sort Eliot was trying to articulate. Even when he was articulating it, we have something more creolized. And as a model for how culture spreads around the world, we might suggest that instead of having a kind of center, which is Europe and the United States, and then the periphery that is everywhere else, we instead move toward a new kind of model, one that's relational, which understands how different cultures intersect with one another, co-constitute one another, that they're not all framed equally in terms of power relations, but that they nonetheless exhibit the kind of dynamics potentially that we see in the Caribbean specifically.